Hey friends, it's Just the Gems. I'm Brandon. Look, I try to foster positivity on this channel. In general, if you ask me about a particular game or series, I can always find something nice to say about it. This doesn't mean that I don't have opinions or that I don't have preferences. Far from it. I just think positivity is healthier. Like, mentally, of course, but also physically. People who are negative all the time, you can kind of see it in them, can't you? It takes a toll. So I try to stay positive. Still, every now and then it can be healthy to acknowledge the negative. I've played a lot of games over the years, and I definitely haven't loved all of them. If you've seen enough of my channel, you probably have a decent sense of the sorts of things I like. If you find your tastes generally aligning with mine, then maybe hearing my negative takes on some games will help you avoid a similar bad experience. Or maybe you just want to hear me talk trash about some games for a change, and honestly, either way works for me. So let's talk about 5 JRPGs I found disappointing, shall we? And hey, if you like the stuff I do, would you mind clicking like? And if you're new around here and you appreciate JRPGs, maybe consider subscribing? Thanks so much. All right, here we go. I have never been good at picking the winner. I'm terrible at poker, my stock market experience has been pitiful, and the only way I survived the original console war was by owning both the Genesis and the Super Nintendo, because there was no way I was going to risk choosing wrong. Having said that, after the runaway success of JRPGs on the Super Nintendo, I knew which next-gen console I was going to buy. After all, much like the Highlander, there could only be one, and that one was Nintendo. The PlayStation seemed weird, like something the jocks at school might play in between giving me swirlies and stuffing me in my locker. The Saturn, well, it barely registered with me for some reason. Like, I knew it existed, but I just had no interest in it. No, for me, it was the Nintendo 64, because if nothing else, at least Squaresoft would keep bringing Nintendo the goodness. Smash cut to me, years into my N64 ownership, having plenty of games, but exactly 0 JRPGs. I realized my mistake pretty early on. Squaresoft jumped ship to Sony, and they were even putting ads in magazines making fun of me and the console I chose. Horrifying stuff. But I held out hope because there was one shining star by which I could set my life's bearing. One glorious game with one very dull name, Quest 64. I mean, okay, yes, the name should have given me a clue that what I was about to get myself into was not going to shift the foundations of my JRPG-loving world, but I think I had really molderized myself. I just wanted to believe. In Quest 64, you are Brian, a young mage who's setting off to search for his missing father. And when I say Brian is a young mage, I mean very young. Like, this is clearly an 8-year-old boy, and they're just letting him go out and battle monsters? It's grossly irresponsible is what I'm saying. The battle system is pretty interesting in theory. Battles happen right there on the world map, though they're still completely random encounters. You can move around in an octagon and fire magic spells at enemies using the C buttons on the N64 controller. Which, real quick, I hadn't held an N64 controller in ages, and I had to in order to get this footage, and man, I don't like it. It's just not very comfortable. Anyway, so the mix of free roaming and turn-based combat is interesting, but being able to move around the battlefield doesn't actually mean much, except that you're bound to get slammed by enemies as you creep your way into range to attack. You don't really level up either. Every now and then after a battle, you can increase the power of one of your elemental magic spells, but that's it. In practice, it's just no fun. Quest 64 is a big feeling game, but it's all surface area, no depth. The story is bare bones and cliche. There really isn't much in the way of character development. The battle system is painfully monotonous. It's just a mess. I'm grasping at straws trying to find something to compliment it on, something to sweeten the bitter truth of just how incredibly disappointing this game was. I mean, I guess it looked okay for an N64 game for the time, sort of. Not great though. Dang, I don't know. This is a stinker. Avoid, is what I'm saying. Once I wised up and grabbed a PlayStation, I was ready for all the goodness Squaresoft had to give me. Obviously, Final Fantasy VII was the main event, and Xenogears became one of my all-time favorites. But once those were in my rearview mirror, I was eager to tackle whatever else they had coming. One of those earlier 32-bit JRPGs was SaGa Frontier. Now, I was vaguely aware of the SaGa series. I don't know that I knew about Final Fantasy Legends' true identity in Japan as a SaGa game at that time, but I had read import reviews of the romancing SaGa games on the Super Famicom. So, hey, we were finally getting one of those fancy SaGa games in the US. That's great. Graphically, it was definitely a departure from FF7. We're talking old school sprites, but I don't remember that bothering me. I was a graphics hound, like a lot of kids back then, but I was more so a JRPG hound, and when I caught the JRPG scent, I was, at minimum, intrigued. I'd been primed by Squaresoft's output up until that point to expect certain things from their JRPGs. An epic story, for one. Characters I could fall in love with. Battles that were fun, a little challenging, but something that I could definitely wrap my head around. This had been the winning formula since the beginning for Square. So why should I have expected any different? Seriously, I'm asking. Was it well known at the time in the US just how freaking weird the SaGa games are? Look, I'm not throwing shade. I think the SaGa games are super interesting now, and I'll bet I'd even enjoy quite a few of them as an adult. But as a teenager, all hopped up on Final Fantasy and Chrono Trigger and Xenogears, this was complete and utter nonsense. You start out by choosing one of the available characters and you play through their story. I should say story, because holy cow, there's just nothing that interesting happening with any of these characters. On top of that, the game gives you almost no hint as to what you're supposed to do, dropping you on what is apparently a destination choosing screen in Blue's scenario without any context. What the heck is this supposed to be? Who thought this was good? That's just one example. Everything feels disjointed, like the developers had some fun ideas for gameplay systems, but didn't want to be bothered to craft a great game to hold them all. The animation is terrible. Animation this janky wouldn't have been okay even on the Super Nintendo. The music is repetitive and just not super great. The battles are, well, they're okay. I think the battle system is where the SaGa games really shine, and so much of the other stuff that you do throughout the games are in service to making a compelling battle system. But Brandon does not live on battles alone. Games like Live Alive and Octopath Traveler showed me that I do like games with split narratives, short stories in game form. For a long time, I thought I didn't, and it was because of this game. Now I realize this one just isn't very good. One of the first games I reviewed on this channel was Astria Ascending. I was still trying to figure out what this channel was going to be at the time, so I went super weird with that one. Ruined a perfectly good suit. But anyway, I was excited for what was almost certain to be a great experience based on pedigree alone. And you know I consider pedigree pretty important. See my recent upcoming JRPGs with a pedigree video for evidence of that. Anyway, Astria Ascending had a story by Kazushige Nojima, one of the writers behind some huge Final Fantasy games, like 7. And it had music by famed composer Hitoshi Sakimoto. So I was ready to find a new favorite. Unfortunately, things started rough, and then they just got rougher. I'm not a huge fan of JRPGs that use side-scrolling as their primary method of traversing the world, so Astria Ascending already had that going against it. Still, with the right story, the right music, the right combat, I can overlook the side-scrolling. I really enjoyed Child of Light, for example. But the side-scrolling nature of the game was just the tip of the iceberg. The story has an interesting premise. An evil force known as the Noise threatens the peaceful world, and 8 heroes are chosen to fight it. This happens over and over throughout history, and after 3 years of fighting, those 8 heroes all die, or ascend, in the parlance of the game. Now, I love a story that starts in media res. That's Latin or something for in the middle. And it's a great storytelling technique for building intrigue. The problem here is that the story starts a little too media res, too in media. It's too much. The 3 years that the heroes have to live and fight is already down to 3 months. That means the characters all have had 2.5 years to get to know each other, but we, the players, don't know them at all. There's little in the way of exploration of these characters' depths because the team is already assembled, the mission is already underway, and for crying out loud, we've only got 3 months before everything is over. The story isn't helped by the pretty mediocre voice acting and inconsistent direction. An example of that, so characters all pronounce key terms differently, suggesting this was maybe recorded from individual actors' homes, and the voice director was phoning it in. And the music isn't bad or anything, but it wasn't memorable to me, so I can't really give it any points. The combat is turn-based, and it borrows some pretty good ideas from other games, like the ability to gain and spend points on your turn in order to beef up your attacks, and the need to exploit enemy weaknesses instead of just mindlessly slamming the attack button. Sadly, it's definitely the most grindy and unforgiving modern JRPG I've played in a long time. The combat's fun, but it's not so fun that I want to run back and forth fighting the same enemies for hours at a time. Besides that, the other systems that make up the game are far too complicated. There are multiple class systems, for example. I didn't say multiple classes, I said multiple class systems. There are skill trees and permanent choices that lock you in on specific growth paths, and all in all, it's just a heaping helping of the sort of stuff I'm not crazy about in JRPGs. I think this one has a bit of a following, so see what some other people think about it if you're considering trying it out. But for me, there just wasn't enough going on to hook me and keep me interested. It hurts me to have to do this one. I love the Tales series, despite my long-running feud with Tales composer Motoi Sakuraba. Wait, can you call it a feud if one party doesn't know the other party exists? Yeah, whatever. I'm a huge Tales fan. What it lacks in the memorable music department, it makes up for with fantastic stories and charming characters and incredibly fun battles. And Tales of Xillia is one of my all-time favorite Tales games, so naturally I was thrilled to learn there was a direct sequel, something that doesn't happen all that often in the Tales universe. And maybe I should take this moment to remind you that this is not a list of 5 bad games that I hate. It's a list of 5 JRPGs that I found disappointing. That's a big difference. I don't hate Tales of Xillia 2. I just wanted it to be something that, unfortunately, it wasn't. I'm going to try and talk about this in a spoiler-free way, which is a bit of a challenge because one of my major issues with the game is the direction they took the story. Let me try and put it like this. My favorite aspect of the original story was its characters. And I'm not crazy about how they characterize some of the characters in the sequel. So some of my disappointment comes down to simple storyline choices made by the writers. And that's fine. It's their story, they can tell it how they want to. But the changes they made to a certain character really bummed me out. And it sucked a lot of the enjoyment out of the experience for me. Also, and this is the big one, there's a completely new main character this time around, and he's... Ugh, this sucks. He's a silent protagonist. Just threw up in my mouth. Yes, this series that hangs its hat on its rich characterizations and charming party interactions experimented with a silent protagonist, a trope they have not tried since. Having a silent protagonist undermines the storytelling and sucks the life out of a game like this for me. Other than that, it was a solid Tales game, great combat, nice graphics, but those story and character issues diminished the enjoyment for me. I still finished it, but it definitely wasn't as satisfying as a Tales game should be. It feels a little strange to pick on a game like Final Fantasy III, especially since it's one of the Final Fantasies I've played the least of, but if we're talking about disappointments, I can't let this one off the hook just because of its heritage. We obviously missed out on Final Fantasy III the first time around, I think because Nintendo thought that both 2 and 3 looked and played too similarly to the original Final Fantasy. I don't know. The West really got the short end of the stick in the before times. So I definitely have to acknowledge that I'm missing some vital context, and the lens I view Final Fantasy III through is distorted at best. But in the 90s, I got my first computer, and I discovered the wild world of ROMs, and more importantly, translation patches. This meant I could dive into a ton of the games we missed out on over the years. Naturally, being a massive Final Fantasy fan, there were 3 games I needed to experience. Final Fantasy V, Final Fantasy II, and Final Fantasy III. I was genuinely surprised by Final Fantasy II. For a game releasing so close to the original Final Fantasy, the upgrade in terms of storytelling and character work was startling. There was an actual cast. You had new people rotating in and out of your party. There was a story with antagonists you could hate and real stakes. Now, on the gameplay front, it wasn't great. And Final Fantasy II really feels like it should be a SaGa game in terms of its gameplay systems, if not its story. Leveling up was replaced by post-battle stat upgrades based on what happened in the battle. It's a system that makes sense in theory, but that lends itself to some goofy exploits that suck the fun out of the experience. See videos of people beating up their own party to improve their defense stat as just one example of that. But still, it was a cool experience. Enter Final Fantasy III. Knowing that Final Fantasy II was so story-heavy, and of course being an enormous fan of Final Fantasy IV and its storytelling prowess, I was eager to see the evolutionary step that Final Fantasy III must have been. What I found instead was a bizarre step in the opposite direction. The cast of characters is replaced once more with 4 basically identical characters. The story is not as bare bones as the original, but it's definitely more challenging to get into a story when there are no distinct protagonists. The gameplay introduced the world-famous job system, which was revolutionary and important in the grand scheme of the series, but I'll confess I've never been a huge fan of it, so its intro here didn't do much for me. I couldn't get into it. It felt weird to feel so disconnected from Final Fantasy, to feel like I suddenly wasn't the target audience. Maybe this is how so many of you feel about Final Fantasy 15. Anyway, Square seems to have implicitly acknowledged Final Fantasy III's shortcomings because in its Nintendo DS remake, they tried to retcon some distinct names and personalities onto the main characters, which is definitely an improvement, but there's only so much you can build on top of a thin foundation, so it didn't ultimately make the game that much more palatable for me. I plan on playing through it in its entirety in the Pixel remaster though, and we'll see if older, wiser Brandon feels any differently than dumber, less wrinkled Brandon did. So, those are 5 JRPGs that disappointed me. I have more, but maybe we'll save those for another video. Do you agree with me? Fervently disagree? I'd love to hear why in the comments. And drop any examples you have of disappointing JRPGs or games in general down there too, why don't you? If you like this, can you click the like button? And if you disliked it, like say if I dissed your favorite game, can you click dislike? And JRPG fans, if you're not already, would you mind subscribing? It means a lot. Anyway, that's all for now. Until next time. Bye.